ELI5 with Japan's population falling for the 18th year in a row. Why is that a bad thing? It isn't bad. It's bad for the economy, as less people means you don't get growth. It's good for the country, which is filled with very crowded cities. Japan is slowly moving towards a more stable and sustainable state, with likely less than half its current population by the end of the century. For quality of life of ordinary people, it's a good thing. For people who want, or benefit, from numbers that go up forever, it's bad, as they lose profits. It's not inherently a bad thing, they just have an economic model set up one way, and this doesn't fit into that model, but they don't want to change it. It's not just Japan either, it's a few more places than that. If you change the economic model, it'd have some impacts on trade, but would still work just fine to where this would not be an issue. The major problem is that economics is a social science, and the social sciences are crap. The single best indicator of a country's long-term economic future is the dependency ratio. Put all the people who are dependent on one side of the ratio and all the people who they depend on, a family, taxpayers, carers, etc. on the other. The more dependent people there are, the more money is spent on caring for them, and this negatively affects the productivity of the economy. Japan has a lot more on one side than the other. They are going to need more and more taxes to support the elderly, but to keep the current lifestyle, productivity needs to rise. Eventually Japanese products will become more expensive, so people will think twice before buying Japanese products due to high prices. Then Japan can potentially lose even more money, because selling a Nintendo Switch for $300 is better than asking for $400 and selling no Nintendo Switch at all. Because the entire economy is set up like a Ponzi scheme where you need to keep getting more and more people working and consuming to support it. Those who completely lack imagination can't think of any possible way that humanity could look after itself without having this Ponzi scheme in place, so they insist that the sky is falling when anything stops growing, be that population or consumption. It's not. People still aren't taking the climate issue seriously, but we are quite possibly looking at a major reduction in livable land space and substantial reductions in food supply within 1-3 decades if we don't make way more progress than we're on track to make right now. Massive numbers of people will need to relocate, and the last thing we need is for that number to be any higher. It depends how fast it is falling. The headline answer of young people need to produce more to support old people is true. What this means later, retirement and economic growth, doesn't make people's lives better, it keeps it the same, if you are lucky. The positive, there will be some environmental benefits. More immigration can solve this. But the Japanese are famously insular. There are also issues with bringing workers in from other countries. I taught English out there for a while and it wasn't that bad, but Japan hires a lot of Filipino nurses for home health care and they are treated terribly. It was so bad Duarte almost pulled all of them home. This was also the case with my Korean and Chinese friends that lived in the same building. In the short term it's very bad. Too many old people doing nothing being supported by a much smaller youth population, crashing housing market as the supply vastly exceeds demand, collapse of the capitalist market as we know it, because markets will shrink for the first time. But in the long term everyone, and our planet, will surely be better off, because the world, in its current state, is one big pyramid scheme. It only works when there is growth in population, economy, and debt. It needs an increasing tax base and worker base to pay back the money it's borrowed. When the number of workers declines, the system collapses in on itself. Too much is demanded from too few. Arguably, temporarily caring for a large aging population is a better problem to have than endless population growth on a finite planet. I don't want any country to cease existing, but Japan is arguably doing a lot to combat global warming etc. just by not making more people that need more resources. The problem is not the lowering population, the problem is an imbalance of age groups. You want a pyramid almost, the base supports the top and it diminishes as it goes up. If you stop putting in the bottom you start getting an inverse pyramid, and that's not great. No support, because population falling doesn't just mean that population decreases amongst all age groups equally. What population falling really means is that there are less young people and more old and elderly people, and over time it can become a huge issue economically and socially. Capitalism is based on perpetual growth. Whether this is sustainable and possible is a story for another day. This principle can work when the number of consumers and workers declines, so the Japanese economy will likely get into an everlasting recession because of this. Japan is a low birth rate and an aging population. This means that there are fewer working age people generating tax income and doing the jobs that need doing, and more elderly people needing looking after, and more government money needed to pay for their care. Aging population, more people leaving the workforce. Population decline, less people entering the workforce. Less people entering the workforce, less taxable incomes. Less taxable incomes, less money for social safety nets, infrastructure, etc. Less working people who produce resources. More dependent people who consume resources. More burden on young working people, thus make them even less productive and less incentivized to make children burden until 20. The downward cycle continues. There are certainly positives and negatives to it. In the long run, it is going to happen around the entire planet. There are lots of things that will help alleviate the problems associated with it. There will still be pain, however. The economy is forced into perpetual recession, which means everybody's life gets progressively worse. Young people have to work really hard to support a crushingly large retired population. Government steadily loses tax revenue, because they are running out of people to fill positions in society. The elderly are an ever-growing part of their population, and the demands of caring for them are putting a serious strain on the society. Scientists, population decline is a bad thing because there will be fewer people available for doing labor and manufacturing. Also, scientists, robots and AI will do all the labor and manufacturing very soon, because the world is a Ponzi scheme dependent on an ever-growing population. Population, inflation, and GDP need to grow constantly under any model we have. Obviously, not sustainable or desirable. Modern economies are sort of built around the expectations of growth. Combined with the other factors people mentioned, a declining population generally means stagnant or falling economy. Having a smaller population is not necessarily a bad thing, but the transition to a smaller population is painful because you temporarily have lots of old people who can't work. More people are getting older means one more people to care for than there would be available to care for them. 2 Japanese people are dying faster than they are reproducing. The solution is simple, but they don't want to have non-Japanese people ruin their pure racist blood with mixed kids, lol. Call it xenophobia if that makes you feel better. The Wikipedia article on Japan's declining population is actually quite interesting. Gonna have a bunch of old invalids with no one to care for them and no one working, and thus paying taxes to fund sad care anyway, because it makes it harder for those poor businesses to keep on increasing profits. Won't somebody think of the stockholders? It's not. There are plenty of immigrants available, but for some reason, they don't want that solution. I wonder why? Because corporations only care about perpetual growth, and perpetual growth is hard with a declining consumer base. Depends on what you're concerned about. Climate change? It's a very good thing. Resource usage? Very good thing.